Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that sounds both mildly scandalous and surprisingly cozy if you let it wash over you. We're going to drift through the world of medieval hygiene. Specifically, the women. Yes, the queens, the nuns, the milkmaids, the unfortunate peasants. Basically anyone who happened to exist between about the year 500 and the year 1500, and who had to deal with the daily reality of dirt, disease, and a very limited supply of soap. So, get comfortable, dim the lights, make sure your blanket is tucked up around your shoulders, and let's relax into a world where perfume was basically a medieval form of pest control. Baths were suspiciously rare, and lice were such a constant companion that combing them out was practically an act of courtship. Now, let's set the stage. If you've ever seen a medieval painting, you'll notice everyone looks strangely clean and glowing. Hair like golden threads, cheeks delicately pink, gowns crisp and radiant. Spoiler, that is not reality. That is an artistic convention. The real Middle Ages were, let's just say, less airbrushed, because the truth is most people smelled like a combination of wood smoke, unwashed wool, and the kind of sweat that accumulates when you wear the same linen shift for 3 weeks straight. And this wasn't because they were lazy or that they somehow didn't care. It's just that the cultural idea of clean was not the same as ours. For medieval women, hygiene was a mix of superstition, availability, and practicality. Bathing too often was sometimes considered unhealthy. Dirt wasn't always viewed as dirt. It could be protection. And besides, when your well is frozen in January, or you're carrying water in heavy clay jugs from half a mile away, you don't exactly run a daily bubble bath. So let's start floating through some of the details. Hair first, because hair was a battlefield. Medieval women, rich or poor, had to deal with lice. Everyone did. Queens had lice. Nuns had lice. Probably saints had lice, though no one bothered to paint that part in the stained glass windows. Combs were a staple item, often made of bone or wood. And they weren't just for styling. They were lice-hunting tools. A woman might sit by the fire, combing slowly through her hair. And yes, picking out the wriggly little souvenirs of medieval life. Sometimes this was done with the help of a sister, a friend, or a servant. Think of it like bonding time. Today, we watch Netflix together. Back then, you deloused each other. Very wholesome, if you squint. Now, washing hair. That depended. Soap was expensive, and medieval soap was nothing like our lavender-scented, moisturizing, dermatologist-approved formulas. It was harsh, often made from animal fat and lye, and not exactly gentle on the scalp. Rich women might use rose water or vinegar rinses for freshness. Peasant women might stick to water, if water was available. But the idea of shampooing every couple of days was not a thing. You'd wash your hair when it became unbearable, or when a special feast day was coming up, or if you were lucky enough to live near a bathhouse. Otherwise, scarves, veils, and wimples covered a multitude of sins. Let's glide now to the subject of teeth. Were they brushing? Sort of. Medieval dental hygiene was a mix of herbs, powders, and superstition. Women might rub their teeth with a cloth dipped in sage, mint, or even crushed charcoal. Sometimes salt. Sometimes urine. Yes, urine. because it was believed to whiten teeth. And in fairness, it kind of does due to the ammonia. Doesn't make it pleasant, doesn't make it minty fresh. But it was an option. Toothbrushes, as we know them, didn't arrive until much later. So most women relied on chewing sticks, cloths, or just hoping that no one noticed the situation inside their mouth. Now let's talk about bathing. This is where things get both stranger and more familiar. Bathhouses did exist in medieval Europe. Cities like Paris, London, and Prague had public baths. Women went to them, often in segregated groups, sometimes mixed. Bathhouses were social spaces, places for gossip, relaxation, even meals. Some were respectable, some doubled as brothels. And then came the Black Death and waves of plague, which made people suspicious of public spaces and water. Suddenly, sitting half naked in warm communal water seemed like a very good way to die, and not in a romantic way. By the later Middle Ages, many people bathed less frequently. Washing hands and faces daily? Yes, that was encouraged. Full body immersion? Maybe once a week, maybe once a month. Or if you were unlucky, maybe never at all. And medieval women had to be practical about this. Instead of daily baths, they turned to linen. The linen shift, worn under clothing, absorbed sweat and body oils. It was easier to wash a piece of fabric than an entire person. So laundry day carried a lot of the burden of hygiene. You strip off the grimy shift, scrub it in the nearest stream, dry it, and put it back on. Instant refresh, sort of. Perfume also became a big player, especially among the wealthy. Medieval women might carry pomanders, little decorative balls filled with fragrant herbs, spices, or resins. Rosemary, lavender, cloves, musk. Not so much for attracting lovers, but for covering up the everyday stench of life and, importantly, warding off disease. Bad smells were thought to cause illness, so good smells were protective. If you've ever walked behind someone wearing a little too much perfume, you can thank medieval superstition for laying the groundwork. Now, we can't tiptoe past the subject of menstruation. What did medieval women do? Spoiler: not a lot. Pads and tampons as we know them didn't exist. Some women may have used rags, hence the phrase, on the rag. But there's evidence that many simply let it flow. Underwear was not standard, especially for peasants. So yes, clothes took the brunt of it. Richer women could afford linen cloths, which they washed and reused. Poorer women often did not bother. And considering how much laundry was already a hassle, you can imagine why. Let's float briefly into the world of skincare. No, they didn't have Sephora, but they did have remedies. Medieval women mixed ointments from honey, milk, and herbs. Honey was a favorite. It's antibacterial, and it gives a nice glow. They also used lead-based powders to whiten their faces, which, yes, slowly poisoned them. But beauty standards demand sacrifices. A pale complexion meant you weren't out in the fields, which meant you were wealthy, which meant you had value. So if your face fell off by age 40, at least you looked fashionable getting there. Clothing itself played into hygiene. Wool outer layers, linen underlayers, and layers upon layers meant sweat got trapped quickly. Summer heat was brutal, but modesty demanded coverage. Women might roll up their sleeves or splash water on their necks and wrists, but mostly they just dealt with it. Imagine August in a castle hall, rushes on the floor, candles burning, bodies pressed together, and not a stick of deodorant in sight. That was the medieval vibe. We should also talk about childbirth, since hygiene there was crucial. Medieval midwives had their own sets of tools, herbs, and rituals. Cleanliness by modern standards, number. But within their framework, yes. Linen cloths, warm water, fumigating the room with herbs, all part of trying to keep mother and child alive. Mortality rates were high anyway. But women did what they could. And for many, the rituals themselves provided comfort, even if the science behind them didn't quite pan out. Finally, a word about superstition. Hygiene was not just physical, it was spiritual. Medieval women believed washing at certain holy wells could cure illness. They believed charms could protect against lice or plague. Relics of saints were thought to bring health, and since the church frowned on vanity, grooming was often framed as a necessity, not a luxury. Cleaning your body was fine, as long as you weren't too proud about it afterwards. So that's our first drift through the world of medieval women and their daily hygiene. Less fragrant roses, more smoky wool and herbal vinegar. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't modern, but it was their normal. And now that we've gotten comfortable with the basics, let's float over in part 2 to some of the more elite examples. Because if you thought queens had it easier, well, not always. Sometimes being royal just meant your disgusting habits came wrapped in gold brocade. So, we've wandered through the general scene of medieval women's hygiene. Now let's glide over to the castles and courts, where the noble women and queens lived. You might assume they had it better. More servants, more luxuries, more chances to stay clean. And yes, they did have resources peasants couldn't dream of. But the funny thing is, wealth doesn't always translate to hygiene. Sometimes it just translates to fancier ways of being gross. Let's start with Eleanor of Aquitaine. Powerful queen, mother of Richard the Lionheart, all-around medieval legend. You'd think she'd be enjoying rose-petal baths daily. Not exactly. The 12th century wasn't a golden age of plumbing. Her court still dealt with chamber pots, lice, and clothes that rarely saw soap. What Eleanor did have, though, was perfume. Wealthy women like her imported exotic scents, ambergris, musk, cinnamon oils, not just to smell nice, but to signal power. If you smelled like something that had to be hauled across the Mediterranean by traders, people knew you were important. Still, under all that musk, Eleanor was human. Sweat, grime, and all. And then there's Isabella of France, the so-called she-wolf of France. Married to Edward II of England, she had plenty of drama in her life: rebellion, intrigue, execution plots. But in terms of hygiene, she too lived in a world where chamber pots were emptied by servants, floors were covered with rushes, and body odor was the background music of daily life. Rich women didn't usually do their own laundry. They had laundresses, which sounds convenient, but it also meant you were relying on other people to notice when your underclothes were too disgusting to keep wearing. And medieval etiquette manuals remind us that noble women were supposed to be discreet, never to scratch themselves in public, never to sniff too loudly, never to show the world that they too had bodily functions. Good luck with that in a wool gown in midsummer. Speaking of laundry, let's talk fabric. Noble women's gowns were often made of velvet, silk, and brocade. Gorgeous, but nearly impossible to wash. Soap would ruin the dyes, water could shrink the fabric, and scrubbing wore it out. So gowns were aired out, brushed down, and sometimes sprinkled with herbs to smell fresher. The linen undershift carried most of the actual filth, and those got washed. But the fancy dress, it might go months without touching water. Imagine going to banquet after banquet, your dress picking up wine stains, sweat, smoke from torches, and the occasional rat droppings from castle rafters, and then just brushing it off and wearing it again. That's noble life for you. Bathing for the wealthy was both more accessible and less frequent than you'd think. Queens sometimes had private tubs brought into their chambers, wooden tubs lined with cloth, filled with hot water by servants carrying buckets. Herbs and flowers might be added for fragrance. But here's the catch. Bathing too often was considered risky. Doctors warned that water opened up the pores, making the body vulnerable to illness. So while the occasional luxury bath did happen, daily bathing, not recommended. Noble women might bathe a few times a month or less, and when they did, it was often more about relaxation than true scrubbing. Think spa day, but with a lot less chlorine. Now, let's float over to the subject of cosmetics. Noble women in medieval courts liked pale faces. The paler, the better. And how did they get that glow? Not with healthy skincare routines, but with lead-based powders and mixtures of vinegar and chalk. Queen Elizabeth I, later on, would be the poster child for this, though the practice existed earlier. Lead did a great job of making the skin look white and smooth, right up until it started corroding the skin underneath. Noble women might also pluck their hairlines to get a high forehead, a fashionable look. Imagine sitting in your chamber, carefully yanking out hairs at the front of your scalp, while a servant grinds up toxic powder for your face. Relaxing? Probably not. But fashionable? Apparently yes. And then there's the matter of toilets. Castles had guardrobes, basically little stone rooms with holes built into the wall, leading to shafts that dropped waste down into cesspits or the moat. Noble women used them just like everyone else. Privacy was minimal, smell was guaranteed. And because medieval castles were cold and drafty, sitting in a guardrobe in January must have been an experience all its own. For women in particular, long gowns and layers made the logistics complicated. Servants sometimes assisted, so yes, even queens had attendants helping them use the toilet. Very regal. Let's glide into the bedroom now. Not for romance, but for cleanliness. Beds were luxurious compared to peasant pallets. Feather mattresses, linen sheets, heavy coverlets. But washing sheets, a hassle. Beds could go weeks, sometimes months, without a full change. Fleas and lice happily cohabited with royalty. Noble women tried to keep things fresher with sprigs of lavender or dried herbs tucked into bedding. Did it work? Somewhat, but not enough to make a medieval bed the restful sanctuary we think of today. We also have to mention childbirth among noble women. Queens were expected to produce heirs, often repeatedly. Hygiene was, well, let's just say risky. Birthing chambers might be fumigated with herbs and incense. Midwives and ladies in waiting assisted. But sterile conditions were not possible. Even queens died regularly in childbirth, despite all the wealth in the world. Noble women sometimes fasted, prayed, or wore charms to help them through the ordeal. It didn't make much difference. Childbirth was still one of the most dangerous parts of a woman's life, whether she was milking cows or sitting on a throne. Finally, we can't forget that noble women were constantly judged for their appearance. Court life revolved around looks, manners, and reputation. So even if hygiene practices weren't modern, the pressure was. Queens like Isabella of Castile or Margaret of Anjou weren't just political players, they were walking billboards for their dynasties. Smelling pleasant, looking pale, being polished in public, all mattered, even if behind the scenes they were just as smelly and exhausted as everyone else. So yes, noble women had access to rosewater, perfume, and silk gowns. But they also had lice, smelly guardrobes, and toxic face powder. Their disgusting habits were simply dressed up in luxury, which is almost worse because at least peasants weren't pretending. And with that, let's float gently onward to part 3, where we'll look at nuns and convent life. Because if you thought religious women were squeaky clean, think again. Their hygiene had its own quirks, and some of them were surprisingly earthy. So, we've peered into peasant villages and noble courts. Now let's shuffle quietly into the convents and abbeys, where nuns lived out their days in prayer, routine, and, yes, questionable hygiene. Because when you lock a group of women together in stone buildings with limited plumbing and a lot of incense, things get interesting. Let's set the scene. A medieval convent was supposed to be a place of purity, both spiritual and physical. But purity didn't always mean cleanliness. The rules of religious orders often emphasize humility, modesty, and avoidance of vanity, which meant that things like regular bathing or grooming could be seen as a slippery slope towards sin. After all, if you spent too much time washing your hair, weren't you basically flirting with pride? Better to stay a little grubby and holy. But even holy women had bodies, and bodies need some level of upkeep. Convent rules varied depending on the order. Some allowed occasional bathing, often before major feast days or important ceremonies. Bathhouses existed in certain monasteries and nunneries, but bathing was usually communal and clothed. Imagine rows of women in long smocks sitting in warm tubs, half praying, half washing, trying not to make eye contact. A very serene mental image, at least until you remember the water probably wasn't changed very often. Hair care was another matter. Many nuns shaved their heads, or kept their hair cropped short under veils. This reduced the need for constant washing, but it didn't stop lice. Head lice were practically a communal activity in medieval institutions. Nuns may have spent hours picking through each other's veils and scalps, just as peasants did. The difference? They did it while reciting psalms. Now, about clothes. Nuns wore habits, simple gowns usually made of wool, and wool, as we've mentioned, doesn't wash easily. Linen undergarments absorb sweat, and those were washed when possible, but habits themselves could go weeks or months without laundering. To keep things manageable, convent laundresses might use streams or rivers near the abbey. Washing was done by hand, with homemade soap that smelled more like ash than lavender, and drying, usually just draped over bushes or rocks. So even in the most sacred spaces, your holy habit could smell like wet sheep half the time. Convents were also notorious for their smells, and not in a nice incense-filled way. Buildings were poorly ventilated, packed with women, and lit with smoky candles. Add chamber pots, unwashed wool, and damp stone walls, and the result was an aroma best described as medieval eau de pénitence. Privies existed, of course. simple pits or guardrobes. But managing waste for dozens of women in an enclosed space was never going to be a clean job. Sometimes convents hired laborers to empty cesspits, but until then, the smell was simply part of life. And speaking of chamber pots, let's not forget that some nuns, especially in stricter orders, had to share dormitories. Privacy was minimal. Imagine rows of wooden beds, each with its own little pot tucked underneath. Nighttime noises and smells were simply endured. It was all part of the discipline, or at least that's how the abbesses framed it. Holiness through inconvenience. Food also played a role in hygiene. Many convents followed strict diets, lots of bread, beans, vegetables, and fish, but not much meat, which was fine for the soul, but less fine for digestion. Let's just say that medieval religious women were not strangers to stomach issues. Combined with the less than ideal privy situation, the convent atmosphere wasn't exactly rose-scented. Now, you might think surely religious women tried to stay clean for spiritual reasons. And sometimes, yes. Bathing before communion, for example, could be encouraged. Symbolic washing of hands and feet played a role in rituals. Some saints even became famous for extreme cleanliness, or, on the other end, extreme filth. Because in the Middle Ages, dirt could also be holy. Refusing to wash was sometimes seen as a mark of devotion, a way to reject worldly vanity. Saint Agnes of Montepulciano, for example, was said to have worn the same habit for 20 years. And while hagiographers describe this as virtuous, we can imagine her sisters in the convent weren't thrilled to share a dormitory with that level of holiness. And then there's menstruation. Yes, the universal constant. Medieval nuns had to deal with it too. Hygiene products were limited. Linen cloths, moss, or just letting garments absorb what they would. Convents had laundresses who worked specifically to clean menstrual cloths. And while it wasn't talked about openly in religious writings, it was certainly part of everyday convent life. Some theologians even saw menstruation as a spiritual trial. One more cross to bear, quite literally. Of course, convents weren't only about filth. There were efforts to stay clean and healthy. Herbal gardens often included plants for medicinal washes. Rosemary, lavender, and sage might be steeped into water for cleansing. Some convents brewed their own rose water, used for both ritual and hygiene. And, unlike peasants, nuns had the stability of regular meals and somewhat better living conditions, which meant they often lived longer. Filthy, maybe, but surprisingly sturdy. So, convent life was a mix of holy dirt, communal lice, smoky air, and occasional herbal baths. The women inside might have prayed for purity, but their bodies told another story. If sainthood had a smell, it was probably a combination of incense, sheep wool, and chamber pots. And with that gentle thought, let's drift into part 4, where we'll look at childbirth, midwives, and the often terrifying hygiene around bringing new life into the medieval world. Because nothing says bedtime relaxation like medieval obstetrics. If you thought convents smelled a bit rough, wait until you step into a medieval birthing chamber. Childbirth was one of the most universal and most dangerous parts of medieval life, and hygiene, well, let's just say that modern hospitals would weep if they saw how things were handled. Picture it, a dimly lit room warmed by a smoky fire. Curtains drawn tight. Childbirth wasn't something to be done in public, so most women gave birth surrounded only by other women, family, neighbors, and, most importantly, the midwife. Men, including the husband, were almost always kept out. This was considered women's work, and the midwife was the queen of the scene. Midwives weren't just birth attendants. They were herbalists, healers, and community experts. They knew which teas eased labor pains, chamomile, fennel, or raspberry leaves, which charms might ward off evil spirits, and how to handle complications. But despite their knowledge, there was little they could do about germs. The concept of germ theory didn't exist yet. No gloves, no sterilization, just bare hands, reused cloths, and prayers. Sanitation was creative. Some women gave birth on straw laid out on the floor. Others used wooden stools with a hole in the middle. Essentially early birthing chairs. Linen sheets were spread, but they were washed and reused many times. Water was available, yes, but it was often cold or not particularly clean. Hot water was sometimes boiled for bathing the baby afterward, though not always for cleaning the mother during birth. And then there were the smells. Blood, sweat, burning herbs, and sometimes smoke from incense meant to cleanse the air. In reality, incense mostly masked the odors, turning the room into a strange mix of floral perfume and iron tang. For pain relief, options were limited. Ale or wine was often given to take the edge off. Herbal remedies included poppy, henbane, or mandrake, plants with sedative properties, though dangerously strong if misused. Prayer and chanting were also common, especially invoking saints like Saint Margaret, patroness of childbirth. Some women clutched relics or amulets, believing they could speed delivery. The midwife's tools were simple: knives or scissors for cutting cords, swaddling bands, wooden spoons to help reposition babies, and plenty of cloths. But nothing was sterilized, and infections after birth were tragically common. Many women didn't survive childbirth, not because of the act itself, but because of what came after. Fever, sepsis, and hemorrhaging claimed countless lives. Newborn care was equally rough by today's standards. Babies were quickly washed, sometimes just wiped with cloths. Their umbilical cords tied with thread, and then they were swaddled tightly in strips of linen. Swaddling was meant to keep them straight-limbed and calm, but it also limited movement and sometimes caused sores. Midwives often blew gently into a newborn's mouth if it didn't cry immediately, hoping to start its breathing. Religion hovered over every birth. Baptism was urgent. Because infant mortality was high, many babies were baptized within hours, sometimes even by the midwife herself if death seemed imminent. A woman could labor for days, but the moment the child arrived, the focus shifted to saving its soul, even before ensuring the mother's recovery. And what about hygiene for the mothers afterward? They were typically put into lying-in periods, about 40 days of rest, during which they were meant to recover. In practice, many women, especially peasants, went back to work much sooner. Washing during this period varied. Some women were washed with warm herbal water, others not at all, depending on custom and resources. For wealthier women, things could look slightly different. Noble households sometimes prepared birthing chambers, decorated with tapestries and herbs meant to promote health and ward off evil. Special foods like broths, eggs, and wine were served to strengthen the mother. But even in castles, sanitation wasn't much better than in cottages. Rich or poor, the risks were the same. Perhaps the strangest part of all this was how childbirth mixed the sacred with the unsanitary. On one hand, it was wrapped in rituals, prayers, blessings, and saintly invocations. On the other, it was messy, painful, and profoundly unhygienic. The miracle of life came with blood-stained sheets, chamber pots shoved into corners, and reused cloths that carried the danger of disease. And yet, medieval women did it again and again. Large families were the norm, and midwives remained the unsung heroes of the age, guiding women through danger with little more than herbs, hands, and hope. So, as you drift towards sleep, imagine the quiet strength of those midwives, whispering prayers in smoky rooms, holding life and death in their hands, and keeping communities alive, one birth at a time. And when you're ready, we'll move on to part 5, where we'll step into the streets and look at medieval public health, markets, waste disposal, and the eternal struggle against filth in daily life. Now that we've tiptoed through smoky birthing rooms, let's open a window, though maybe keep it only slightly cracked, because the streets of a medieval town were not the fresh air paradise you might hope for. In fact, they were the complete opposite. Picture a narrow lane, cobblestone if you're lucky, dirt if you're not. Buildings lean inward, upper stories hanging over the road so much that neighbors could practically shake hands from opposite windows. Sounds cozy, right? Well, beneath those charming timber beams lay a ground-level nightmare. Mud mixed with horse manure, spoiled food tossed from kitchens, and, yes, human waste. A medieval street cleaning service was usually the reign. Cities had latrines, but they weren't always used. Many houses had chamber pots, and chamber pots had one simple rule: empty them out the window. The polite version was shouting, "Gardes l'eau," basically, look out for the water. The less polite version was just tossing it. Imagine walking home after a long day, only to get hit by a surprise bucket of urine. It happened a lot. Cesspits were common, especially in towns. These were deep holes dug into the ground, lined with stone, where waste collected. In theory, night soil men, yes, that was an actual job, came to empty them. In practice, they often overflowed. And when they overflowed, the street became one large open-air sewer. If you're wondering about the smell, yes, everyone noticed. Chroniclers from London to Paris complained about it constantly. But city governments were inconsistent about doing anything. Markets were no better. Meat was butchered in the open air, blood draining into the gutters. Fishmongers tossed scraps right onto the ground. Bakers, at least, provided a nice smell, but the bread was often mixed with dust from the street. Flies swarmed everywhere, happily feasting on whatever scraps they could find. And then there were the animals. Horses, of course, but also pigs, goats, chickens, and dogs all roamed the streets. Pigs were especially notorious. They acted as medieval garbage disposals, eating whatever they could find. But they also left their own messes behind and occasionally attacked people. Yes, street pigs were such a menace that laws had to be passed in Paris and London about keeping them out of certain neighborhoods. Water supplies didn't help either. Wells were sometimes dug right next to cesspits, which you can probably imagine. Rivers ran through many cities, but they were both the source of drinking water and the dumping ground for waste. In London, the Thames was nicknamed the Great Sewer as early as the Middle Ages. If you wanted to drink clean water, you either boiled it or you drank ale. This explains why even children drank weak beer at meals. It was often safer than water. Did cities try to fix this? Sometimes. Medieval governments did issue rules. Don't dump waste in the streets. Keep butchers outside the city walls. Don't let your cesspit leak into the neighbor's well. But enforcement was weak. Officials often took bribes, and most people just went back to their old habits once inspectors left. Public health boards did exist in some places, especially during outbreaks of plague, but their efforts were patchwork at best. And then there was the smell. Chroniclers describe whole neighborhoods where the stench was so bad, even residents complained, though they had been born into it. Londoners in the 14th century were furious when butchers slaughtered animals by the city gates because the odor of rotting entrails was carried by the wind for miles. In Paris, people complained about tanneries and dyers dumping chemicals into the Seine. And yet, both cities grew larger and more crowded every year. So, how did people cope? Well, they got used to it. Smells were just part of life. People burned incense, carried nosegays of herbs, or stuffed lavender in their clothes to mask the odors. It didn't clean the streets, but it made them a little more bearable. Now, before you drift too far, imagine walking slowly down one of those medieval lanes. Timbered houses leaning above, a pig snuffling in the corner, the air carrying the mix of smoke, manure, and roasting meat. It wasn't glamorous, but it was normal. This was the backdrop for everyday life. And with that, let's float gently onward to part 6, where we'll peek inside castles and noble households to see how the wealthy tried, often badly, to keep themselves clean, perfumed, and slightly less smelly than everyone else. Let's leave the pig-filled streets behind and step into a castle. You might expect polished stone, tapestries, shining floors, basically a medieval version of Downton Abbey. In reality, noble hygiene was just as questionable as the peasants. It was simply wrapped in fancier fabrics. Castles were drafty, smoky, and loud. Fires burned constantly, filling rooms with soot. Windows, if they existed, were tiny slits, designed more for shooting arrows than letting in light or air. Ventilation was not a priority. So, what did noble families do? They covered the smell with herbs, perfumes, and endless layers of cloth. Bathing was an occasional luxury. Yes, there were castle baths, large tubs, sometimes big enough for 2 people, often filled with warm water, scented with rosemary, chamomile, or rose petals. But these baths were not taken daily, or even weekly. Monthly might be closer to the truth. Medieval noble women prided themselves on delicate skin, which supposedly meant not scrubbing too much. Washing your face and hands was common, but full immersion? Reserved for big occasions, weddings, holy festivals, or, you guessed it, when doctors told you to balance your humors. Clothing was the next line of defense. Layers upon layers of linen shifts, underskirts, gowns, and overdresses. The logic was simple: don't wash your body, just wash your clothes. Linen could be boiled and bleached in the sun, so women often wore a fresh shift daily. But the heavy outer garments, those might go months without a proper cleaning. And when you're living in a castle full of smoke, sweat, and dogs roaming freely, you can imagine how fragrant things became. Speaking of dogs, castles were full of animals. Hunting hounds padded through the great halls. Cats chased mice in the kitchens, and falcons sometimes perched indoors. With animals came fleas, lice, and general filth. Bedchambers were not the pristine, private sanctuaries you might imagine. Servants often slept on the floor in the same room, and straw was used for bedding in guest halls. Even the noble's four-poster bed was a paradise for insects. Curtains weren't just for privacy, they were bug protection. Toilets in castles deserved their own moment. The fancy word was garderobe, which sounds elegant until you realize it was basically a chute built into the wall, dropping waste straight down into the moat or a cesspit. If the wind blew the wrong way, the smell drifted right back into the room. And garderobes weren't private. Servants cleaned them, emptied them, and sometimes had to climb down the chutes when blockages occurred. A truly unlucky job. So, how did noble women cope? Perfume was the answer. Scented oils, pomanders filled with spices, and rosewater sprinkled on clothes. Noble ladies carried small bags of herbs to sniff during church services, where the smell of hundreds of unwashed bodies could overwhelm even the most devout. Hair was washed occasionally with herbal rinses, chamomile for blondes, sage for brunettes, but again, not often. Head coverings were essential, not just for modesty, but to hide the greasy truth beneath. The greasy truth beneath. And then there's dental hygiene. Toothpaste, as we know it, didn't exist. But noble women had concoctions of crushed herbs, salt, and even ground up bones to rub on their teeth. Some were rinsed with wine or vinegar. Did it work? Well, not really. Chronic toothaches were so common that medieval dentists, barbers really, were kept busy pulling rotten teeth. The smell of bad breath was universal, yet nobles still believed they were cleaner, more refined, and more godly than the masses outside their walls. In some ways, they were right. Clean linen shifts, perfume baths, and herbal rinses did help a little. But in many ways, they were just as grimy. Their castles stank of smoke, sewage, and dogs. Their bodies carried lice, fleas, and skin conditions. Their idea of hygiene was closer to cover it up and hope no one notices. Still, when compared to the street filth outside the castle gates, you might forgive a noble woman for thinking she was practically sparkling. And with that, let's gently move toward part 7, where we'll peek into the world of medieval cosmetics and beauty routines, because nothing says sleepy history like a noble woman smearing lead paste on her face in the name of looking radiant. Now, we drift into the softer, stranger world of medieval beauty routines. You might think, after hearing about garderobes and fleas, that noble women would have given up on appearances. But no, if anything, beauty standards got more ambitious the dirtier life became. The ideal medieval woman was pale, very pale. So pale she looked like she had never stepped outside. A glowing ghost in saffron silk. Why? Because pale skin meant wealth. It meant you weren't laboring under the sun in the fields. You had servants to do that. Pale skin was status, plain and simple. So how did women achieve it? Enter makeup. The most popular foundation was made from white lead paste. Yes, actual lead. It created a chalky porcelain effect that looked ethereal by candlelight and slowly poisoned the wearer. Over time, lead makeup caused rashes, cracked skin, hair loss, and eventually neurological problems. But hey, it looked good at court dinners. For blush, women used crushed berries or red ochre. Lips could be tinted with plant dyes, or, more dangerously, cinnabar, a mineral form of mercury. Again, beauty was literally toxic. If you're wondering whether anyone noticed the side effects, the answer is yes. There are records of doctors warning against lead and mercury cosmetics. But vanity always won. Because what's a little slow death compared to looking like a saint in a fresco? Eyebrows and hairlines were another obsession. High foreheads were considered elegant, so fashionable women plucked their hairlines back to make their foreheads look taller. They even shaved parts of their eyebrows. The result? A strangely elongated face that looked like an alien Madonna. If you've ever seen a medieval portrait of a woman with what seems like way too much forehead, now you know it was on purpose. Hair itself was often hidden. Married women covered it with veils, wimples, or elaborate headdresses. But underneath, hair care was simple. Washes with rosemary or sage, sometimes rinses of vinegar or beer. Greasy hair was common, so braids and coverings helped disguise it. Blonde hair was especially prized, so some women tried to lighten their locks with saffron or lemon juice. Rudimentary medieval highlights. Perfume came next. Rosewater was the classic, sprinkled on skin, clothes, even onto handkerchiefs to wave under the nose during church. Musk and ambergris, yes, that's whale vomit, were imported luxury scents. Perfume didn't just mask odor, it was thought to have health benefits, protecting against disease by purifying the air you breathed. Of course, it didn't, but at least you smelled like roses while catching the plague. Teeth were tricky. Noble women wanted white smiles, but sugar was becoming more common in Europe, and sugar is a dentist's nightmare. Remedies included rubbing teeth with cloth dipped in salt, herbs or powdered charcoal. Some even used crushed eggshells. None of this stopped cavities, but it did make for some creative mouth rinses. Bad breath? Covered with cloves or anise seeds, chewed discreetly. And jewelry, because why not add sparkle on top of lead paint? Pearls, gold chains, jeweled pins, all glittering against pale faces and perfumed gowns. It was a whole sensory performance. Sight, scent, texture. Nobility were staging themselves as living works of art, even if the canvas underneath was rotting teeth and irritated skin. What's fascinating is how much of this was copied from ancient Rome. Roman women had also used lead makeup, painted lips, and scented oils. Medieval Europe resurrected those ideas, layered them with Christian ideals of modesty, and turned the whole thing into a paradox. You had to look ethereal, saint-like, untouchably pale, but you achieved it through vanity, poison, and plucked eyebrows. The irony was almost artistic. So, the next time you see a medieval painting of a serene lady with a giant forehead and a smooth white face, remember, she probably smelled of rosewater and lead, and she definitely hadn't bathed in weeks. Let's float onward to part 8, where we'll peek into the odd rituals surrounding pregnancy, childbirth, and women's health. Because nothing quite says restful bedtime history like medieval medical advice that involves onions, prayers, and amulets. So far, we've wandered through lead makeup, guardrobes, and flea-ridden castles. Now, let's talk about something even more central to women's lives in the Middle Ages: childbirth and health. Spoiler alert, it was not glamorous. Pregnancy was constant. Noble women, peasants, queens, didn't matter. If you were married, the expectation was children. Many, many children. And without modern medicine, each pregnancy was risky. A noble woman might spend her whole adult life either pregnant, recovering from pregnancy, or preparing for the next one. No wonder so many portraits show women with tired eyes. Prenatal care, if we can call it that, mixed herbal remedies with prayer. Women wore amulets against miscarriage. Charms inscribed with religious verses were sewn into clothing. Priests blessed bellies. Midwives brewed teas of fennel, sage, or rue, thought to strengthen the womb. And then there were the less subtle methods. Onions placed near certain body parts, or fumigations with burning herbs. Did they help? Probably not. But the ritual gave comfort. When labor came, it was women's business. Midwives took charge. Husbands were usually kept away, unless they had a religious relic to wave around, which was thought to ease the birth. Wealthier women might clutch a saint's bone or a piece of the Virgin Mary's veil, or what someone swore was the veil. Peasants relied on strong hands, neighbors, and hope. Childbirth was dangerous. Many women died in labor or from infections afterward. Midwives had knowledge passed down orally: how to turn a baby, how to use herbal poultices, how to stitch with linen thread. But complications were often beyond anyone's help. Records from noble families are full of mothers and infants who simply didn't survive. Life was fragile, and birth was the proof. Postpartum practices were equally strange. Women were expected to purify themselves after birth before returning to church. This ritual, called churching, was half blessing, half superstition. Until then, new mothers were often secluded, wrapped in bed, tended by female relatives. It was both rest and quarantine. And contraception? Well, that was a minefield. The church officially condemned it, but folk remedies abounded. Herbal brews of pennyroyal or tansy were common, though both were toxic in large amounts. Some women carried amulets with dried animal parts, believing they could ward off conception. Others relied on timing, withdrawal, or just cross fingers. Unsurprisingly, these methods were not very effective. As for women's general health, doctors didn't pay much attention. Most physicians were male, and they focused on male patients. Women were thought to be governed by cold and moist humors, making them prone to weakness. Treatments often involved bloodletting, leeches, or balancing the womb. Hysteria, literally wandering womb, was a popular diagnosis for everything from fainting to anxiety. The cure? Marriage, sex, and childbirth. Yes, the medical advice was basically, have another baby. That'll fix you. Spoiler, it didn't. We can laugh now, gently, at the absurdity. But for medieval women, this was life. Herbs, relics, whispered prayers, and resilience. Survival depended on the skill of midwives, the luck of the body, and sometimes sheer chance. So, the next time you picture a medieval noblewoman gliding through a castle in perfumed silk, remember that behind the veil and the lead powder was a body working overtime, bearing children, managing illness, and hoping the local midwife had her fennel seeds ready. Now, let's float into part 9, where we'll explore how women dealt with aging, wrinkles, failing teeth, and the bittersweet role shift from childbearer to matronly advisor. Because even in the Middle Ages, no one escaped time. So far, we've drifted through makeup, childbirth, and noble guardrobes. But what happened when a medieval woman grew older? In a society obsessed with youth, fertility, and beauty, aging was its own kind of transformation, sometimes respected, sometimes ignored, always unavoidable. First, the obvious, wrinkles. In an age without Botox, retinol, or Instagram filters, there was no hiding the lines. Recipes existed for youthful skin. Salves made from honey, egg whites, or almond oil. Some women applied mashed herbs or vinegar rinses. Others stuck to the tried and true lead paste, which cracked less gracefully with age. But still, time left its marks. Wrinkles were seen as signs of wisdom by some, of decline by others. Hair grayed early, especially with poor diets and stress. Noble women sometimes dyed their hair with herbal rinses, walnut husks for brown, saffron for golden tones. But covering grey was difficult. So head coverings did the heavy lifting. Veils, hoods, and wimples were practical, hiding thinning or silvering hair while signalling dignity. A matronly wimple could transform an aging face into something respectable, even serene. Face into something respectable, even serene. Teeth, unfortunately, did not age well. With sugar creeping into diets, especially for the wealthy, decay set in quickly. By middle age, many women had lost teeth or suffered abscesses. Remedies included rinsing with vinegar or chewing parsley to freshen breath. Tooth loss was often accepted as normal. A matron's smile was less about pearly whites, more about carrying herself with composure despite the gaps. Menopause was poorly understood. Without medical knowledge of hormones, it was often seen as mysterious, even suspicious. Some thought older women's bodies became cold and dry, making them less prone to illness. Others thought it made them more dangerous, fueling stereotypes of witches. Indeed, many accused witches were older women, no longer protected by fertility, living on the margins of society. The line between respected elder and suspicious crone could be thin, but not all aging was negative. For noble women, surviving to middle age brought a shift in roles. No longer expected to bear endless children, older women gained authority in households. They managed estates, advised younger relatives, and carried influence as widows. A dowager countess or queen mother could be a formidable figure, no longer competing in the beauty stakes, but commanding respect with age. Think less wrinkled peasant and more iron matron with a rosary in opinions. Fashion adjusted too. Bright, flirtatious colors gave way to darker, richer tones. Burgundy, deep green, somber blues. Jewelry became heavier, more dignified. Older women were not invisible. They simply dressed to signal gravitas instead of allure. In paintings, they often appear sober-faced, veiled, holding prayer books. Their role shifted from embodying beauty to embodying piety and stability. Of course, aging was easier if you had money. Peasant women aged hard and fast, their bodies worn by labor. Wrinkles, tooth loss, and frailty came quickly. Noble women, cushioned by servants and softer tasks, might stretch their lives further. But no one escaped entirely. Life expectancy was short. Reaching 50 was impressive. Reaching 60 made you almost legendary. And so, the image of the medieval matron, lined face, covered hair, perhaps a missing tooth or two, wrapped in linen and velvet, holding a sprig of rosemary for both scent and memory. Not glamorous, not saintly, but deeply human. So, as we close this part, let's remember, even in the Middle Ages, the clock ticked the same way it does for us. Vanity, health, and time all danced together. Wrinkles came, teeth fell out, reputations shifted. And somewhere, an older woman sat by a smoky fire, quietly judging the younger ones with their lead-painted foreheads, probably thinking, "I've survived all this nonsense. Let them learn for themselves." Now, let's drift into part 10, where we'll soften into the twilight world of medieval superstitions about women, their bodies, their souls, and the strange myths that lingered. We've wandered through cosmetics, childbirth, aging. But to truly end, we need to step into the shadowy corners of medieval thought. The superstitions about women that mixed fear, religion, and folklore into one tangled web. To begin, medieval medicine already saw women's bodies as unstable, ruled by fluids and cycles. But superstition pushed things further. Take menstruation. Period blood was said to wither crops, dull mirrors, and even kill bees if it touched them. A menstruating woman, according to certain church writers, could turn wine sour with just a glance. Imagine the suspicion, the whispered blame when anything went wrong in the household garden. Pregnancy, too, carried superstition. Some believed a woman's cravings could shape the child. Crave strawberries, and the baby might be born with red blotches. See something frightening, and the child might bear its mark. Women wore charms or carried relics during childbirth. St. Margaret's girdle, for example, was tied around a laboring mother's belly to ease delivery. Was it faith? Was it magic? In the Middle Ages, the line blurred. Then there were midwives, women both trusted and feared. Skilled in herbs, prayers, and practical tricks, they could bring life into the world. But in times of paranoia, that same knowledge branded them dangerous. How did she know which herbs stopped bleeding? Why did her words calm fevers? Perhaps she had made a pact with darker powers. Many later witchcraft accusations had their roots in this fear. The idea of the evil eye haunted women's reputations too. A woman thought to be jealous or bitter could supposedly curse with a look. New brides, newborns, and even livestock were thought vulnerable. Amulets, rings, crosses, even small animal bones were carried to deflect these imagined curses. Women who were widowed or unmarried past youth were especially vulnerable to whispers of the evil eye. Hair carried superstition as well. loose hair was seen as wild, uncontrolled, even demonic. Brides wore it down only once, on their wedding day, before veiling or binding it forever. A woman with uncovered flowing hair could be viewed as seductive, sinful, or even a witch in disguise. The veil was not just modesty, but spiritual protection. And then came the darkest superstition, the association of older women with witchcraft. Once past childbearing years, women lost the social role that had protected them. No longer mothers, they became other, suspect, vulnerable to accusations. If cows stopped giving milk, if storms struck unexpectedly, if bread failed to rise, someone might glance toward the quiet, wrinkled widow at the edge of the village. And in those glances, lives were destroyed. Yet superstition was not always cruel. Some beliefs gave women hidden strength. Amulets blessed by holy women were prized. The prayers of nuns were believed to be especially powerful. The Virgin Mary stood as a protective figure whose image was stitched into charms, painted in homes, and carried on journeys. Women, though bound by suspicion, also carried the aura of divine guardianship. In the end, medieval superstition about women reveals as much about fear as about faith. Women's bodies were mysterious, their roles vital yet misunderstood. And when ignorance met anxiety, stories filled the gaps. Blood that killed crops, eyes that cursed, hair that tempted demons, age that summoned witches. So, when we step back, the medieval woman stands not just as a figure of flesh and bone, but as a canvas of belief, both honored and haunted, both sacred and suspicious. And with that, our journey through the disgusting hygiene habits and more of medieval women comes to a close. From chamber pots to charms, from paint pots to prayers, we've seen how daily life mixed with fear, faith, and the fragile human struggle to stay clean, stay safe, and stay understood.